everyone. This is Sophie here. Welcome back to Life Unpotted. Thanks for joining us for another episode. So if you're new here, we want to just take a minute to just let you know what Life Unpotted is, who we are, and how we kind of got started on this. So I'm Sophie, and I host this podcast with my girlfriend, Daisy. We started this podcast about over a year ago. We were at this confusing point of our life where we were questioning everything, wanting to understand better, like, who are we? What are we doing? Why are we on this earth? And from there, we ended up starting a podcast. We were originally called Wildflowers, and we ultimately rebranded to Life Unpotted. So Life Unpotted is all about questioning your thoughts, questioning your emotions in a way that allows you to live life in the moment and ultimately live a life that's true to you. So each week we kind of just go through our thoughts, go through emotions in real time, our experiences that we're having, because we're currently going through a lot of change right now. So as always, take with it what you will. You know, we're just sharing our experiences. That's all this is. And what we keep finding is that since we are all connected, we often all have very similar experiences. So that's just the point of this all, so that we could all just live and enjoy our freaking life. Because honestly, it's really hard to do that sometimes. So if you have not already, please rate, review, subscribe to our podcast. It really, really helps us with our growth. As you may not know, we are now doing this full time because we are so passionate about having this platform where we can connect with ourselves and connect with other people and ultimately allow other people to blossom and grow into the best version of themselves. So yeah, I think that's it for my little intro. Daisy, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think it's good to do a little intro for you guys. A reminder, there's a lot of you joining recently, so I want to give you all an idea of who we are.
For sure. So I'm excited for today's episode, mainly because I've been struggling a lot the past few days and honestly the past few weeks. And I think what I just want to start off saying to whoever is listening is that your thoughts and your emotions are never permanent. They are never, ever permanent. And I think that when we get into these phases where we're in this very low point of, it's like these emotions are taking over us. It's like our mind is telling us every single reason why we should give up. And in these moments, it feels like this is going to last forever. Like it feels like you just don't know what to do because all you're experiencing in that moment is those thoughts. And the reality of it is it sucks when our mind wants to control us. And it's really hard to be a human being because we're constantly battling us being this ever-present awareness that is aware of all this stuff versus our thoughts. And sometimes it really does feel like that, where it is us versus them. Because there's times where I'm just so freaking frustrated and angry. And I'm just like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. Like, I don't want to have these thoughts telling me that I'm a failure or that I'm a loser or that I'm not going to make it. And I think that I have done a lot of work, and it just, you know, it's interesting. A lot of these self-help, self-growth podcasts, whatever, there seems to be this idea that there's somewhere you're going to get where you know everything. But recently I had this experience that confirmed that no matter how much work you do, no matter how much clarity you have, as long as we're alive, we're going to have points of confusion. As long as we're alive, we're going to have points where we just do not know how to move forward. And we are just so caught up in our mind and our thoughts. And all we want to do is give up and just scream and cry. And I just think that is a human experience, man. Like, I just think that is a human experience. So I think that's kind of what we want to talk about today is like the reality of this human experience, the difficulties of this human experience, but the recognition that nothing is ever permanent. So instead of resisting it, maybe what we could just decide when we are in those moments to say, hey, I feel like absolute shit right now. And that's okay, because I have felt like this a few weeks ago and a few weeks before that. And what is the main theme throughout all of it is that I will feel good again. So I think there's a lot, but I think this is just something I've really been experiencing. So I kind of want to kick it off with that.
No, Soph, I think that was a really great intro to this topic, because if you listen to this podcast or if you're new on this podcast, you know that we try to walk you through our experiences in real time as we're going through things, even though we know that, one, we are in our thoughts, two, we're connected to everyone. Just because we can know those things, that doesn't mean that we aren't constantly falling into traps left and right. And as Sophie and I were preparing, having a chat before this episode, before we hit record, we wanted to be intentional with talking to you all and not just saying, one, You're not your thoughts. You don't have to listen to your thoughts. Because what about those times where you're hit and you're not literally, but metaphorically, you're hit and you're blindsided. And before you know it, you're thrown so far into the abyss into an experience that you are experiencing that your thoughts are real. And that's what Sophie said earlier. Your thoughts, maybe she didn't, but she said it to me, your thoughts are hell. And there are times where you can't decipher between reality and your thoughts, because that's a reality. Sometimes we fall into a place where we think our thoughts are real, even if, say, 70% of the time we can recognize and create separation and distance between us. Like, that's still pretty fucking good if you can do that 70% of the time. But, that 30% of the time where you're blindsided and all of a sudden you start to question everything you believe, you start to question everything you're doing, and you're questioning everything. And I think that can happen, especially when you're changing your life up, or especially when you're dating a new person, or especially when you're moving and making a change in your life, whatever it could be. There's going to be times where we have experiences where out of nowhere, we question everything. And for this podcast topic, for this episode today, we want to be very intentional in walking you through what that looks like for us as we're going through it. And we had an experience that really brought that up recently. So that's really what we want to get into. And I can speak to that a little bit here as well. And I am having deja vu because we typically talk about the same thing on these podcasts, but that's because we all are constantly falling back into this place that we want to get out of. So I think what we do here is we work through it in real time for you to show that you're not alone. You're not the only one who's going through this, because look, especially if you're a woman listening to this podcast, you're going to realize that right before your period comes, that can also be a time where your thoughts spiral and they tell you things. And that can be a time where you kind of are in the graps of listening to your thoughts. So all of that being said, my side of the experience that I had was, yes, some may call us a little crazy or a little reckless because we are moving to a new city. We don't have income. We're planning on getting part-time jobs. We're planning on living off our savings. We're planning on pursuing our dream. That makes us very anxious sometimes. There's other times where I feel so confident because I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this happen, make this podcast be continuously growing. And the experience I had was where I saw a lot of fear. I saw a lot of doubt within myself. I haven't had that level of doubt in years, probably since I met Sophie. I haven't had that level of depths of insecurities coming up, of saying, what the hell am I doing? I don't trust myself. This is all ridiculous. I need to go. I need to get a job. I need to make sure that everything is safe. Everything is very comfortable. And I recognize the way that I realized I was in a thought loop was I was seeking this level of comfort of, when you have a certain paycheck and everything is safe and comfortable, you're going to be happy. And I was like, no. I've been there before. I've had the paycheck that was consistent. And no, it's never enough if you're looking at it that way. It's never going to make you happy. You're never going to have enough, or at least that was my perspective on the mindset I had around it. And I realized that there's no such thing as certainty. We can create this idea of certainty by saying, we have enough money saved here. We have enough paycheck coming in. We have a house we've bought. These are just examples, I think, maybe of past generations. We'll go into the details, but in conclusion, I think the thought loop that I had, I realized everything that I was questioning in that moment led me to a place of comfort will solve all of this. And I've been on the opposite spectrum of that, where I had the comfort and it wasn't what was making me happy. And I realized what I care about is taking a risk on myself. That is what makes me feel good. That's why we do this, is because in the face of adversity, in the face of discomfort, we keep going. That's not to say I'm not still questioning, the real life things of, okay, well, what about health insurance when you're not attached to an employer? What if something happens? How do I take care of that? These are real things that come up. And it's a little bit different than the discomfort of emotional discomfort. And I'll be very clear about that. Those are real life things of a society that we live in that are really scary and uncomfortable. So it's like, well, what do we do? Those are the kinds of thoughts that have been coming up. So I just wanted to be a little bit more elaborate on my side of from the experience we had, but something we're still somewhat actively working through. I think we're feeling more on our feet, but I'll let you continue, Soph.
I think we live in a society that is always talking about how we can strive to be comfortable. Like, I'm just trying to understand in my mind right now, why do we seek comfort so much? Because a lot of the times when we're experiencing these emotions, we're experiencing these thoughts, we're not feeling good, that is uncomfortable. And especially for us right now, like everything we're doing right now, we're literally stripping away every single ounce of comfort we've ever had, starting from when I confronted my sexuality to when I realized I didn't want to be a lawyer to realizing we want to move. Like it is extremely uncomfortable now because I feel like during this change, I'm forced to look at the truth of everything that's really happening. I'm forced to kind of look at like who I really am and who I really want to be in this life, and maybe who people around me really are, or who people I grew up with or my family really is. Like I think when we're in these moments of change and transitory periods, we're really kind of seeing life for what it really is. And I think a lot of the time we just have this like giant band-aid that we put on in life to kind of cover up what's really happening. So I guess I'm just gonna ask you, Daisy, why do you think that like we strive for comfort so much? Like where do we learn this from, that a comfortable life is a happy life? Because like you said, and I completely agree, I had the most amount of comfort in my old job, and that definitely did not give me happiness.
I mean, I think there could be so many answers to this, but I think it's because at the core of it, like we don't like discomfort. I think it's the mentality we have around discomfort. And I think there's a whole range of things that can be uncomfortable, ranging from the emotional state, which we can never escape that, ranging to the financial comfort, or ranging to the societal comfort or the class comfort, all of these different things. So I will be clear, like it's very convoluted, and we are always coming at it for the most part, unless we say otherwise, from the emotional component of it. That's really what we tend to focus on in this podcast. Okay. So I think there is one perspective that I think we kind of live from our background, from our experience, was that we had comfort, we had jobs, and we weren't happy with that. We weren't happy with the traditional trajectory of how our lives were going. And that was from our experience. That was very simple, was that what I was doing, it was comfortable, but it didn't excite me. And it also was not something that felt like I was going anywhere with. It was comfortable, yes, but comfort alone isn't something that worked in that instance. So I think that's one frame of reference. From another frame of reference, I think that we can be looking for comfort from a financial standpoint because it's something that we haven't had before, something that we think will solve all of our problems, and it will solve a lot of problems. But I think you get to that point and you realize that it's not going to solve your emotional problems. It will allow you to have more resources and more time. And those things are all very helpful and very important. But I think ultimately you have to be the person who's ready to face them. So I think comfort is not a bad thing. I don't want to say that. We all want a level of comfort at times. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's when we lean way too heavily into comfort, overly identifying with comfort. Because when it comes down to it, I think, yes, there's times where we need a break. There's times where we need to be able to relax. And maybe your definition of comfort is to be able to have a day where you just relax to yourself, right? Everyone lives in a very different reality, right? So I think when I come back to your question that you asked me, like, why are we so obsessed with comfort? I think my biggest takeaway is that I know comfort is not what allows me to be my best person. I want comfort 30-40% of the time, but that other 60-70% of the time, I want to be pushing myself. I want to be learning and growing and putting myself in uncomfortable experiences. And I think that so much can come from those experiences. We learn from ourselves from those experiences. But it's not to say we want 100% of the time to be uncomfortable. How are you going to recoup, to reflect, to re-pick up the pieces? You need comfort to do that. So I'm reframing it the way we talk about it. I think we've talked about comfort in different ways in past episodes, but I'm trying to think differently and maybe.
Well, I think it's kind of the question of like, and I'm thinking, as you're saying this, what is comfort? Like, let's talk about what it is. And to me, I'm just thinking, so I think aside from like bodily discomfort, so say you're sleeping outside in the rain, or you have an ailment and you really don't feel good, or like your body is uncomfortable. And I think you could apply the same logic to those scenarios, but I think the comfort we are talking about right now is emotional like discomfort. And I think that what that really is like a lack of familiarity.
So I just Googled it, and there are 2 definitions for it, and I think this will be helpful. Definition 1, a state of physical ease and freedom from the pain or constraint. So that's more physical. The second one is the easing or alleviation of a person's feelings of grief or distress.
Interesting. So alleviating a feeling of grief or distress. So, okay. So like, for example, right, we're moving to Austin. I'm living off my savings. I have no idea like what we're doing. And it's like when you start thinking, I think about situations you haven't done before, this anxiety comes up of like, because I can't picture it, because I haven't done it before, there's no way I'm going to be able to do it. I think that's kind of like what discomfort is. It's like doing something you haven't done before. So it's like if I'm going to get a part-time job or I'm going to nanny or I'm going to do freelancing so I can now build this dream that I have of building Life Unpotted, and imagining that might feel really confusing and it might not feel like something I can logically comprehend. And I think all that is because I have never done it before. I don't think society encourages like experiencing new and different things. And that's because we're prescribed this one path of like, get this job, go get married, have a kid, live this life. And it's just like, who decided that that was a way to live life? Like maybe that's the most familiar way, but is that really the best way? And maybe the best way, which is doing something that scares the shit out of you, maybe, yeah, that is going to be extremely uncomfortable for the short term. And I think that's a key word here. I think a lot of the discomfort that we're scared of really will go away once we become used to or familiar with it. Because isn't uncomfortability just a lack of familiarity?
Yeah, I think so. And I think everyone can define what that is for themselves. So maybe having a family and having children is uncomfortable for someone because that is a new experience for them, right? So I don't think we can define what is uncomfortable for someone, but that is something that is clearly comfortable for you, or a clear path that has been laid for you. But I think after looking at the 2 definitions, I think what we are talking about more is emotional discomfort, is less than physical discomfort. I mean, I think they can go hand in hand sometimes. Like you can have a lot of growth from physical discomfort from pushing yourself, whether it's through exercise or, you know, if you're really tired, pushing through that and learning something about yourself. But I think, yeah, I think what you said, I think there is a lot of discomfort and uncertainty. And a lot of it goes back to that for us, because I think what we're learning is that taking it one day at a time and pushing through the discomfort each and every day, knowing that the fear and the discomfort that comes up, the discomfort is temporary. If you stick at something that is uncomfortable long enough, you'll recognize the cycle of the momentary discomfort coming up, and you can recognize it. And kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier of not recognizing your thoughts as truth, I think when you stick at something long enough, you can start to recognize, you know, like I said, 60, 70% of the time when your thoughts are in fact not true or not based in reality. And I think that it's important to recognize that. And again, there's those times where you don't catch yourself. But I think the longer you stick at something, just like anything else, the better you get at it. And that includes catching your thoughts. That includes catching yourself and recognizing when things are not true, or at least recognizing if you can't get out of them, if they're uncomfortable, recognizing that eventually this will end, even though you're believing them to be true right now. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. So I think that with all that being said, life is a balance. Life should be balanced. It shouldn't be all discomfort. It shouldn't be all comfort. It should be something that has both so that you can properly move forward. I don't think anything should be in the extremes.
But I also think there's no shoulds in life. So I don't know if I agree with that. I think I'm just recognizing now it's like everything that we're talking about in terms of discomfort emotionally, all it does is make you face yourself. So it's like, if we can let go of being so scared to face ourselves, for example, I just went through a period, a week, where I was feeling extremely uncomfortable. We went into this new environment. We were interacting with new people. We went to a new state. We were traveling. We have so much freaking change going on in our life. And I was in a very emotionally uncomfortable state. But I think all that was really was just rising to the surface things that still are in my subconscious mind. Insecurities that I have about myself, insecurities that I have about the journey I'm taking, the fears that I have. So it's like, is emotional discomfort nothing more than just facing our truth? Is emotional discomfort nothing more than just acknowledging that maybe there's things that we don't really want to admit? Like maybe we don't want to admit that we're scared to embark on a journey, or that we don't think we're capable of embarking on the journey. Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
Not necessarily, because in my mind, you're in a place that is now comfortable and you're able to reflect on this point when you were uncomfortable. And that's what I mean by balance, is that you don't want to be in a perpetual state of emotional discomfort. Like you don't want to be tripping on mushrooms forever. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. It depends on if you are someone who sees things openly, or if you're going through hell facing what you're experiencing. That's what I really mean. That was my point, and I don't know if you heard that correctly.
No, I didn't. I just didn't understand that. But yeah, I mean, I get that now.
So I think with that being said, to reflect a little bit more on these thoughts that you were having as you were listening to your thoughts, what were some of them where you realized that you thought your thoughts were true? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was in this social situation of meeting new people and being around new people. And I feel like it was really making me think about myself a lot. And I think I haven't been like thinking about myself that much because I've been in a situation, to use the word comfortable, of familiar in my apartment every day, doing the same thing over and over again. So I embarked into a situation that was newer and not familiar. And I think that lack of familiarity brought up all these thoughts where I was just like, I'm extremely overwhelmed. And I think I was feeling overwhelmed about everything. Like I was feeling overwhelmed about like, I just felt really uncomfortable in the situation. I felt like people didn't like me. I felt like I was just judging myself. And I just noticed myself falling into that tendency of like thinking about myself so freaking much. So that was part one. And I think because I wasn't in a situation where I could really have that time to reflect and go inward because we were traveling, when we were like flying home from the trip, I was really anxious on the plane of like, oh my God, like, is where we're moving to safe? Like, am I going to be safe? Like, what am I doing? Like, I'm just like moving to a new city. Just like I was going deeper and deeper and deeper into the spiral. And I think it's interesting because like there is this point of like recognition of like, you're in a spiral. All you're in right now is a spiral. What you're thinking is not true. These fears you're having are not true. And I think eventually I started to get to the point where I could recognize that. But I think it took me a lot of time because there's a lot of like emotions I'm experiencing with this change. So when you have thoughts accompanied by emotions, like I have a thought that this all sucks and I physically feel it in my body because I'm like emotional because I'm moving and I'm processing a lot of change. Like it's hard to not cling to those. And I'm definitely judging this episode right now. I'm like, it sucks. So that's what's coming up for me. Do you think it sucks?
No, I think what you said was just really interesting. I think it's really relatable of oftentimes when you're in a new social environment with people that you don't know, you tend to think about yourself a lot. And I think that is key because I think oftentimes what spurs us to think our thoughts might be true is in a situation where we have to think about ourselves a lot, or we think we have to think about ourselves a lot because we're sizing ourselves up. We're thinking, oh, how am I different from this person? Are they judging me for being different? Are they thinking that I'm this? Are they thinking that I'm that? Are they thinking these things about me? And all those times that you're thinking about how someone's perceiving you, that definitely means that you are thinking about yourself. And that is when I think we start to take our thoughts as truth. I think that is one of the entry points, is when we are so concerned with how we are coming off. And look, I think one of the hardest, most difficult times to not think about yourselves is when you are meeting new people. It's a new experience. It's a new environment. And these are times where we try to figure out where we fit in. So I think I really understand. And I think that experience took me back to being in high school, being in college, moving to new schools where I didn't know anyone, where I was so caught up in how people were perceiving me that I started to create all these narratives about how I was being perceived. And I think that that is a very slippery slope and a very hard place to be, because at the end of the day, when you're in a new social environment, you want to be brought in. You want to be a part of something. And there's a lot of uncertainty there when you're entering an already established social circle. So this brought up a lot of memories from entering a new school where I didn't know anyone, or a new college where I didn't know anyone. And that's where you so desperately need to have an idea of yourself, because that is what's going to say, hey, I'm Daisy. Nice to meet you. Here are all the things that I am. It depends on who you're interacting with. Sometimes you're able to interact with people and that's not necessary. But I think that within social dynamics, it's so easy to get caught up in the idea of yourself.
Well, I think a lot of this comes back from the fact that we think we're the only ones experiencing what we're experiencing. Like, I think that a lot of people don't know how, or weren't taught how to be vulnerable. So we interact with new people. We're in these new social settings and we feel so uncomfortable. I think it's really hard to not think that people are judging you, because when we're in these situations where people have their guards up and they don't feel vulnerable and they feel like really not too open or maybe not too warm, you interpret that to mean that they don't like you or that they think something funny about you. But in reality, what I'm learning from all these situations and all these experiences is that when people are not thinking about themselves, they're going to feel more open and they're going to feel more warm and they're going to feel more vulnerable. So if you're experiencing somebody else feeling kind of closed off and you're interpreting that to mean that they don't like you, you're just really experiencing them judging themselves or them in their own head. But just the point I'm trying to make is that, like, I think it's really easy in this process to feel really alone with your emotions and to feel like nobody else is going through the same stuff. Because when we see people on paper and we just go, or we see somebody on the internet or we see somebody in real life, we're just seeing this like masked version of them where they're like, hi, nice to meet you and blah, blah, blah. And like, you don't know if they just left their apartment and they cried for 1 hour before they met you. You just don't see it. So I think the division in society makes it very confusing, because we're so confused about, like, who am I? Who's everybody else? What is everybody experiencing in this world? Am I the only one who's going through all of this like emotional turmoil? Because then I go meet somebody and they are not going to tell you that most of the time. I think that's why we have this podcast, is to make clear that we all as humans are going to go through this emotional distress and confusion of not knowing what is going on, and the importance of not taking at face value when you see people who pretend to have it all put together, because nobody has it put together. That is just simply a mere illusion. And if you're going to also get caught up on the idea of somebody having put together, that is just reinforcing your own insecurity that the only way to live life is to have it put together.
I think you hit on something interesting there. And I think what it was is that we all, as humans, no one has it figured out. We all have an emotional spectrum. We all experience things. We all have a high and we all have a low. We all experience the full human experience. And oftentimes, people will deny that. They will not, either they don't allow themselves to feel that ever, and they push it down, which I think that is common. Or people do experience it, but they're too afraid. There's other options, but I think that another option could be is that people don't share that side of them with other people because they're afraid of being judged, or they feel that they need to have an idea of who they are presented to the world. And I think from the experience that we've gone through and a lot of the people that we've met is that we have met a lot of people who aren't afraid to show that vulnerable side of them. And I think when we're able to show up as a vulnerable person and have another person be vulnerable, we're able to set aside all the bullshit, all the illusion, all the ideas of ourselves, and we're able to truly connect. And, I think that you have to ask yourself, well, how do I show up to be vulnerable in a situation where I'm not comfortable being vulnerable in? Meaning, oftentimes the reason someone else isn't showing up as vulnerable is because they're too afraid or they don't know how. So I think oftentimes it can be very difficult to show up as vulnerable, even when you do in certain situations, because it's a hard question to answer. Like sometimes it's really hard to be the first one to show up and be vulnerable. And by vulnerable, I mean showing up authentically as yourself, right? And I think that's all this is it's being brave enough to show up as you truly are. And I think that alone gives other people to show up as they truly are. And that, if that was happening with everyone in this world, it would be really, really incredible, because everyone is so unique. Everyone is so interesting. But oftentimes we're told that we can't show up as who we are because it's damaged, or because it doesn't fit, or it doesn't make sense, or, I can go on and on and on. But I think at the end of the day, that's one of the things we hope with this podcast, that we are sharing our experience, is that it helps you realize that you can and you should be yourself, and you should be with people who allow you to be yourself, fill you back up and make you feel good, because it's hard to do that in certain social circles. It really is, when there's so many masks up. So I totally empathize with the listener who, if you are in a very tight community where people tend to put their masks on, I understand how difficult that is to let your mask down within that community if no one else is doing it. Like, that's really hard. And I will be honest, I think for me, meeting Sophie, like, she was the first person I felt like I really took my mask down and really learned how to do that. So I recognize that, it's maybe I've had a good experience with it because I had someone who helped me do that. So I get it. It's sometimes not that easy to do that. But I think finding people who allow you to be you is really important. And that's another reason why we have this podcast, is because we want to inspire others to be themselves, where you don't have to hold on to this mask for your value of who you are.
Well, I think one of the hardest things we can do in this life is be ourselves. And you might hear that and you might think that, oh, that means, being yourself has to do with sexuality. Like, yes, it really does. But being yourself means that you're going to walk into that room and say that quirky thing, or do that thing you think is weird, or express yourself in a way that you think you shouldn't. And it's like, when we're walking around and we're in this environment where everyone around us is wearing this mask and pretending to be somebody, and we all go home and we take off the mask and we're miserable and we're just so uncomfortable, and we wonder why. It's just like, it could be really, really hard to decide you're going to take that off. But the benefit is, and what we're seeing in life now, is vulnerability is getting embraced. Vulnerability is strength. Vulnerability is human. We're no longer denying our emotions. We're embracing our emotions. We're stepping outside the illusion. We're not living in a fake ideal, or maybe the generations our parents grew up with where it was scary. You were shunned if you talked about your emotions. Like, my mom always says, like, you were like, if you told someone you were in therapy in the 60s, they would be like, what's wrong with you? Now it's just a recognition that is everyone. That is all of us. Like, we are all struggling. And I think the importance of recognizing that you aren't struggling, because what you're doing is just experiencing this human experience. And the more open we can be and the more vulnerable we can be with each other, and that starts small. That starts with your relationship to yourself. That means showing up as you really are to yourself, showing up who you really are to your partner. Because as you start small and as you start showing in your small circle the people who you really are, and if that, as Mel Robbins says, is that just looking into the mirror and looking at yourself and saying, hey, who you are is beautiful and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that the world would be a beautiful place if we could all embrace that and recognize that there's nothing wrong with anyone. There never has been anything wrong with anyone. And it's just these ideas and these concepts that we believe that we hold on to for no other reason than for comfort, and to stick with what we know, to stick with what our parents knew, what people around us knew. All the while, we're all just suffering deep down, and our life is fleeting, and it's just, we want to be ourselves so bad, and we just don't know how. So I just think that, like, if there's anything to take away from this episode, it's that fuck comfort, man. Screw it. Like, happiness is not going to come from staying in that protected shell. Happiness is going to come from embracing who you truly are, no matter how scary that is, no matter how much insecurities that bring up, no matter how much everyone around you is saying, wait, why are you doing that? Because at the end of the day, this is your life. It is your life. And there's going to come a time where everybody around you maybe won't even be alive. Or the people around you, you're not going to live with them anymore or live around them. And all you're going to have is yourself. And that's the only person you're going to be able to look to. And you're going to ask yourself, did I live for me? Or did I live for everybody else around me?
Yeah, to sum up our conversation today, for the listener, for you who are listening to this podcast, I would say, one, when we get caught up thinking about ourselves too much, we're going to start being afraid to be ourselves, I think. I think there is a strong correlation between a strong identity of who we are and being afraid to be ourselves, if that makes sense. Because I think the more closely we can move towards not over-identifying with us and who we are, our identity, the more we can lean into recognizing there's no difference between me and the person who's sitting next to me on the train. Like there's no difference. There's no division really between us. It's more recognizing it's all love. It's just love. And the more we can just be ourselves, the more I think that is just full of love. And the more we are full of love, the more the person next to us in the train might be full of love if we have a quick conversation. I think that it's a chain of events. And that's why we do this podcast, is because it's not easy to show up authentically and to be yourself constantly and time over and over again with a society that might condemn the thought of doing something that isn't on par. There's so many different realities that people live in. So I think the more you touch and become involved in those realities, the more you might question yourself. And that's why we're here to keep talking about this, is because you can always come back to this podcast to be reminded that there's nothing that's actually wrong in your emotional state. You can work through it. You can become more close to who you are, and you can eventually get to a place where you realize there's no division between you and everyone else. And that doesn't mean that's a constant state of learning that, of realizing that. It means life is a constant place of recognizing this realization. It's constantly picking back up the pieces to realize it's not that serious, to realize we don't have to take things too seriously, to realize it's as serious as we make it, and to realize there's nowhere to get because all we actually have is this very moment right now. So with all of that being said, I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you feel comforted and reminded that there's nothing wrong, that you can do what you want to do with this life, and you can take that next step, and you can enjoy your life as it is right now, despite what is happening, because you have yourself and you are everything. And I think that the more you're able to recognize that, the more you're going to be connected with what is real in this world. And what is real is just us all being connected and love, honestly. So I don't know if you have anything you want to tie it off with, Sophie, but thank you for being here. And please, 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 I'm going to end every episode like this. If you like this episode and if you made it here, you definitely liked it, please go follow our podcast on Spotify or on Apple Music. Either one, whichever one you listen, please go do that.
Sarah, my little sister, corrected. It's Apple Podcast, not Apple Music.
I know. I recognize that as I said it. But anyway, either one, Apple Podcast or Spotify, wherever you listen, please just follow it, because that's what's going to help us grow and get ads and keep on going. So please, if you do that, I'll be so appreciative. I'll see that number go up, and it means you'll be reminded more often every Tuesday when we release this podcast. So you'll know when we're releasing episodes.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. I think just the one final thing is just remembering that, like, it's going to be scary to be yourselves, and living and getting the life you want is going to be uncomfortable, but don't run away from that discomfort, because all that discomfort is venturing into a new area, and eventually you'll know and feel comfortable in that area. So take it each day. Don't get discouraged. Don't get scared when things are falling out of place, because I think a lot of times life is actually working out for us, even though it feels like it isn't. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.